branches of magazine publishing. The introduction of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Superman in 1938 turned comic books into a major industry. Okay, so it basically started pretty much with Superman in 1938. The Silver Age of comic books is generally considered to date from the first successful revival of the then dormant superhero form with the debut of Flash and Showcase #4 in October 1956. Oh, gotta love Flash. Gotta love Flash. So, the Silver Age lasted through the late 1960s, early 70s, during which time Marvel Comics, of course, revolutionized the medium with such superheroes as Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four, and Lee and Steve Ditko's Spider-Man. The demarcation between the Silver Age and the following era, the Bronze Age of comic books, is less well defined, with the Bronze Age running from early 70s to the mid-80s. The modern age of comic books went from mid-80s to this day. And man, I miss the comic books. Mom used to work in this, it was called Avallone's. It was like a 5 and dime type store. And, of course, they always got the new comic books in. And they were, 10 cents a piece, quarter. Now, I don't even think anybody carries them. I have not seen them. And I really miss the comics. I really do, comic books. When I got a hold of them finally, I just take them in my bedroom, get something to drink, some fruit or something to munch on, and read my comics. It was awesome. A notable event in the history of the American comic book came with psychiatrist Frederick Wertham's criticism of the medium in his book Seduction of the Innocent, which prompted the American Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency to investigate comic books. Really? That's okay, Valerie. I can deal with that. You're my #1 fan. I don't know where Lori's at. I don't know if Chris is listening. Chris, if you're out there. Is anybody else on? I don't think so. Anyway, the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency to investigate comic books. Really? What would they do today, I wonder? I really do. In response to attention from the government and from the media, the U.S. comic book industry set up the Comics Magazine Association of America, CMAA, and it instilled the Comics Code Authority in 1954 and drafted the Self-Censorship Comic Code, which required all comic books to go through a process of approval. It was not until the 70s that comic books could be published without passing the inspection of the CMAA. And the code was finally formally defunct in 2011. Really, it took you that long? Crazy. There were also underground comic books. In the late 60s, early 70s, a surge of creativity emerged in what became known as the underground comics. Published and distributed independently, most of the comics reflected the youth counterculture and drug culture of that time. Many had an uninhibited, often irreverent style. Their frank depictions of nudity, sex, profanity, and politics, and had no parallel outside their precursors. Underground comics were almost never sold at newsstands, but in youth-oriented outlets as head shops and record stores, and by mail order, of course. So it's really interesting that they had an underground comics at that time. Let's see. During the 70s, the small press culture grew and diversified. By the 80s, several independent publishers such as Pacific, Eclipse, First, Comico, and Fantagraphics had started releasing a wide range of styles and formats, from color superhero, detective, and science fiction comic books to black and white magazine formats of Latin American magical realism. And of course you have graphic novels, which, like the Walking Dead graphic novels. It's kind of like comics. In 1964, Richard Kyle coined the term graphic novel. Its precursors of the form existed by the 1920s, which saw a revival of the medieval woodcut tradition. American Lynd Ward and others, including Stan Lee in 1950, St. John Publications produced a digest-sized adult-oriented picture movie. It Rhymes with Lust is the name of it. It's a 128-page digest by Pseudonyms writer Drake Waller, inker Ray Orson, touted as an original full-length novel. In 1971, writer-artist Gil Kane and collaborators devised the paperback comics novel, Black Mark. Will Eisner popularized the term graphic novel when he used it on a cover of the paperback edition of his work. So, and I don't know, I think we still have those comics in our attic at my dad's. So interesting, because they're collector's items now. Who wrote the first comic book? Do you know? And what's your favorite comic out there? Anybody listening, what's your favorite comic? Okay, who created the first comic book? He created the comic strip in 1827, and the comic book graphic novel, Rudolf Topfer, created several graphic novels that were extremely successful and reprinted in many different languages. Several of them had English versions in America in 1846. Interesting. Okay, where and when did comics begin? Okay, despite the publication of a series of related Hearst comics soon afterward, the first monthly proto-comic book, MB Distributing Company's Comic Monthly, did not appear until 1922. Produced in an 8.5 by 9-inch format. You remember the size? They were like sizes of paper, 8.5 by 11, the comic books. They were great. But did not appear until 1922. Produced in 8.5 by 9-inch format, it reprinted black and white newspaper comic strips, and it only lasted a year. When was the first comic strip? The first newspaper comic strip. Oh, Casper, the Friendly Ghost. Yeah, me too. The first newspaper comic strip in the United States was Richard Felton's Occult's The Yellow Kid, which appeared in the Hearst New York American on February 1896. It was published in the Sunday supplement to the paper and was quickly joined by other comic strips. And of course, who didn't love the Sunday paper? By the 1910s, the Sunday comics were so popular that newspapers would occasionally publish small books containing reprints. I don't know if anybody remembers these, but Mom used to pick these up too. There used to be like little paperbacks, like Marmaduke was one, Family Circus was another. They were great. Dennis the Menace, you remember those? Those were really cool. But they were like little paperback comics. Marmaduke I remember the most, because Mom used to get those all the time. Marmaduke, Family Circus. What was another one we got? I have to think on that. There were quite a few. The Sunday comics, they were published in small books containing reprints of past strips, which they would distribute to promote the paper and gain new readers. Soon, other publishing companies, you remember those, Valerie? Yeah, those were really cool. I love those. It was like an added bonus to the comic books. And soon other publishing companies were assembling comic strips from several papers and selling them to merchants to be given away as premiums. In 1934, Eastern Color Printing Company decided to sell these books directly to the public for 10 cents each. American News, which controlled distribution to newsstands throughout the country, initially refused to handle the books, so Eastern Color took them to chain stores. Well, yeah, and they sold 35,000 copies. There you go. And faced with the outstanding yeah, I do too, if you can find them. The old comics, not these new ones. It's like, ugh, really? But because of that trend and success, American News reconsidered and ordered 250,000 copies of Famous Funnies #1 from Eastern Color. It went on sale in July 1934 and became the first published comic book to be sold at a newsstand. There you go. During the late 1930s, many of our now famous superheroes made their first appearance in comic books, and comic book sales soared as good triumphed over evil. By the early 50s, however, readers grew tired of superheroes, and some comic book publishers turned instead to lurid crime and horror stories with graphic illustrations. Some people felt this material was unsuitable, and the comic book industry became under investigation, which, of course, we went through that, the code. Comic books enjoyed a resurgence of interest during the 80s when fresh new artists created a whole new cast of heroes and heroines. Today, comic books are as popular as ever, and the comic book industry is a $1 million business. I'd like to find some of the older ones, though. I really would. In 1922, Charles Schulz was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota. After World War II, he freelanced for a Catholic magazine and taught in a correspondence school, renamed the Art Instruction Institute. His work first appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, and eventually he created a cartoon entitled Little Folks. But guess what? Charles Schulz. We all know. Oh, do you have a comic book store there? Very cool, Valerie. So his first appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, and his cartoon was entitled Little Folks. So the United Feature Syndicate of New York proposed publication of Schulz's Little Folks. But guess what it was renamed? And we all know and love Peanuts. And it was renamed Peanuts by the company. In 1950, the cartoon made its debut in 7 newspapers. Within a year, the strip appeared in 35 papers, and by 1956, in over 100. And he received the Reuben Award from the National Cartoonist Society. By 1965, Peanuts appeared in over 2,300 newspapers, and the classic cartoon, A Charlie Brown Christmas, won a Peabody and Emmy Award. God, who doesn't know Peanuts? If you don't know Peanuts, then I don't know what to tell you. I really don't know. He got several awards and honorary degrees, and a Charles M. Schulz Award honoring aspiring comic artists was created by United Feature Syndicate in 1980. The year 1990 marked the 40th anniversary of Peanuts, and the Smithsonian Institution featured an exhibit and I lost my notes. Featuring an exhibit titled This Is Your Childhood, Charlie Brown. Children in the American Culture, 1945 to 1970. By the late 1990s, the syndicated strip ran in over 2,000 newspapers throughout the world. And it's so sad because he died on February 12, 2000, the night before his last original Peanuts strip ran, announcing his retirement. And that's so sad. Peanuts, you gotta love Peanuts. What was the first comic book superhero? Does anybody know? Well, I'm going to tell you. The Golden Age, 1938 to 1950. In the Great Depression, World War II era, the first superhero comics appeared. And of course, we all know and love them. Superman, Batman, Captain Marvel, Wonder Woman, and Captain America. You gotta love them all. And now look at them. Love it. Superhero comics are one of the most common genres of the comic books. And it rose to prominence in the 1930s and 40s and has remained the dominant form of comic book in North America since the 60s. And superhero comics, of course, feature stories about superheroes and the universes these characters inhabit.